So, and plus people were using benzene, oil-based sexual lubricants that had benzene in, and there was just an enormous number of factors which you only need to look at people and think, well, they're not likely to be very well. So that's what was going on, first of all. When people were getting PCP, the next reason gay men were dying, essentially, was because then people were starting to be given Bactrim or Septrim or cotrimoxazole, as it's called, as it's actually known also, in fairly large numbers. Now, this is a seriously toxic drug, which is now, in the UK, for people that are not diagnosed HIV positive, they won't even give it to you for only 2 weeks, because it causes mitochondrial toxicity, can cause severe skin reactions, and one of its ingredients also actually has been found to be, which is trimethoprim, has found to be as effective at suppressing the immune system as a drug that was used to deliberately suppress the immune system to stop people rejecting organ transplants. So essentially, once people were diagnosed HIV positive, even before AZT came out, large numbers of people were given an essentially immune-suppressing drug. But the other thing, of course, is that people were taking these things and still carrying on with a lot of the unsafe behaviours because it had become part of the, if you like, the gay identity.
Yeah.
For people in this fast lane lifestyle. Then, of course, the next thing happened, you got AZT, and that resulted in essentially the mass slaughter of huge numbers of people, including people like Freddie Mercury, for example.
Right. Is that what happened there?
It's interesting. There was a program about Freddie Mercury's lovers on some while back, and when they interviewed one guy who's about the onset of AIDS, and one guy said straight off, at first we thought it must be all the poppers we're taking. Well, he could have been, largely right, because people had started to take them in absolutely vast numbers, in huge quantities, where you even got poppers pumped into the ventilation shafts of clubs. So the problem is that even if you ticked no, you weren't taking recreational drugs on a form or a survey, for many people, poppers were not a recreational drug. It was just something you did. It wasn't considered a drug because you didn't inject it. And it wasn't illegal, so it wasn't considered a drug. But the other thing is, even if they weren't sniffing poppers, they were, many people in this environment, this fast lane lifestyle, were in clubs where poppers fumes were absolutely endemic because so many people were sniffing them directly out of the bottle, and fumes were being pumped into the clubs themselves. So it really was, if you're part of this population of fast lane lifestyle gay men, then it was almost impossible to avoid poppers fumes. And they were found in at least one study that in the very low background levels you'd find that workers in a poppers factory were exposed to, they could severely depress the immune system, make people vulnerable, or make mice vulnerable to low-grade infections which then killed them, and had effects on their organ and spleen and thymus gland. So, there's another thing, essentially, that people underestimated the amount of drug use simply because one of the most prevalent drugs was not considered a drug, and people didn't consider they were exposed to it. Then the next group, of course, when AZT came out, people were being slaughtered in large numbers, and people, based on fraudulent trials, and then all the drugs that followed that, but, you've now got other things where it's now known that things like hepatitis B vaccinations have been documented to trigger false positives. And, of course, the group that is most diagnosed the group that is most persuaded to have hepatitis B vaccinations is gay men. That's also the group that is most persuaded to go and get HIV tested on a regular basis. And of course, you get tested and get tested and get tested, and as soon as you've tested positive, it stops. Because then they say, oh, you've got it for life. But the reality is there can be so many other factors which may trigger a false positive reaction that's already documented in medical literature, that simply by gay men getting tested far more than any other group, you're inevitably going to get a much higher proportion of gay men testing positive. But when you add in the fact that there are still some people that seem to think that the only danger from recreational drugs is they might make you have unsafe sex, which unfortunately is still a fairly widely held attitude, it seems, among some gay men, and you've got people being vaccinated against hepatitis B and other things on a precautionary basis, it's really no surprise that it's still, relatively speaking, a gay disease, because once you've been diagnosed, then they launch at you with intense and prolonged pressure to start taking Septrin in the first place, which suppresses your immune system, and then when your CD4 cells drop, they then ply you with all the toxic liver-destroying AIDS drugs. And of course, the number one cause of death of people diagnosed HIV positive is liver failure.
Wow, it's a lot of information.
Exactly, yes. And now that's just, gay men as an example, because that's the group that's most highly associated. But you also need to look at, let's say, haemophiliacs, because they are often quoted as an example of people who received, who weren't having unsafe sex as such, but they received HIV through blood transfusions. Okay, well, again, the devil is in the detail, and that's the thing that is the most common phenomenon I've discovered with AIDS science is that the devil is in the detail, and when you really look at the detail, the orthodox model of what's happening just slowly disintegrates into dust. So, with haemophiliacs, okay, now HIV is supposed to be this fragile little retrovirus that's so fragile they can't find it in any human body fluid. It's never been found in blood, semen, saliva, breast milk or urine. That they can't find it. Even though people have got viral loads of 50,000 per milliliter, no one's actually managed to find a single actual HIV in anybody's blood. So one of the reasons I say, it's very fragile, Okay, if it's that fragile then, well, how the heck does it manage to survive the process of being injected into someone as factor VIII? Because what they do with factor VIII is, first of all, the blood was filtered, so that takes out all the whole cells, so you only get smaller particles than that left. Well, then it's freeze-dried and ends up as a sort of dry, flaky powder, and then it could be stored for, perhaps weeks or months, and then it would be reconstituted, and finally it would be injected into someone as factor VIII. Now, if HIV is as fragile as the orthodoxy claim, then how the heck could it survive that process? In fact, even the CDC said themselves that the route of transmission was essentially, the probability of transmission by that route was essentially zero, which is what they'd observed. So, okay, let's supposing, so that explains really that it would be pretty difficult for HIV to have actually made it to any haemophiliac via factor VIII itself and be infectious. But you have to look at what actually would have made haemophiliacs ill in the first place. Well, the factor VIII they were getting was essentially pulled from the blood of, possibly thousands of people per dose. But it was also extremely impure. Only 1% of it was factor VIII. Now that means 99% of it is other crap. So to have 1 cc of factor VIII, someone would have to be injected with 99 cc's of other biological material. Now clearly, if that's directed directly into someone's immune system, and that includes other antibodies and cell fragments and bits of RNA and DNA from someone else's DNA, the immune system is going to launch a major abreaction on that kind of thing. But in fact, even just all those antibodies alone may themselves have triggered false positives. But not only that, it's already been published in Nature in, I think, 1990 or 91. They acknowledged that simply the immune system's response to foreign biological matter that was known to have no HIV in whatsoever can also cause false positives on HIV tests. So, for haemophiliacs, you've got them being injected with all this other biological matter from thousands of different people per dose, which essentially makes it less pure than street heroin. And it's essentially, if you allow their immune systems to respond to all that, then they just totally overreact. So they were also given corticosteroids to suppress the immune system, in an attempt to stop their immune systems overreacting to all this foreign biological matter.